Nestled at the edge of Ash Grove, a small town shrouded in mist and memory, stood a house that had been the subject of hushed whispers and fearful glances for over 2 decades. The house, a grand Victorian structure, was once the pride of Briar Lane, with its ornate gables and ivy-covered walls. But now, it loomed like a specter over the town, its windows dark and hollow, its once vibrant gardens now overgrown and wild. For the past 20 years, the house had remained empty, a ghostly reminder of a time when life inside its walls had been anything but ordinary. The townsfolk of Ash Grove avoided speaking of it, the events that had transpired there buried deep in the recesses of their collective memory. Those who knew the truth kept their silence out of fear, afraid that to speak of it might awaken whatever malevolent force still lingered within. But to Emily and David Foster, newcomers to Ash Grove, the house was a dream come true. They were a young couple, eager to start the next chapter of their lives in a place where they could raise their 2 children, 10-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Lily. The house on Briar Lane, with its sprawling rooms and picturesque garden, seemed like the perfect setting for their family's future. When Emily first saw the house, she was captivated. There was something timeless about it, a charm that spoke to her love of history and old-world elegance. She imagined her children playing in the garden, their laughter echoing through the halls. David, too, was taken with the property. It was more than they had ever dreamed of affording, and yet it was within their reach, a stroke of luck, they thought. They never questioned why such a beautiful house had remained on the market for so long, nor did they wonder why the asking price was so low. The real estate agent, a woman with a forced smile and quick explanations, had been vague about the house's history. She mentioned only that the previous owners had left suddenly, leaving the house vacant ever since. Eager to begin their new life, Emily and David brushed off any lingering doubts. After all, they were practical people. Ghosts, curses, and haunted houses were the stuff of fiction, not something they would ever seriously consider. Besides, the house had been vacant for years. Surely, if there was something to worry about, they would have heard about it by now. So they signed the papers, moved in their belongings, and began to settle into what they believed would be a peaceful, happy home. But Ash Grove was a town with secrets, and those secrets were buried deep, much like the history of the house they had just purchased. The townspeople, though welcoming to the new family, were careful to avoid certain topics of conversation. If anyone asked about the house on Briar Lane, they would quickly change the subject, their eyes darkening with unease. The events that had taken place there were something no one wanted to revisit, and so the house's story remained untold, its truth hidden behind walls that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. This house was everything Emily and David had hoped for. The children loved their new rooms, and Emily took great joy in decorating, filling the space with warmth and light. David spent his weekends working in the garden, clearing away years of neglect to reveal the beauty that had once flourished there. Emily was a devoted mother and wife, and her days were filled with laughter and love, her world revolving around her family. Emily and David hosted dinners, invited friends over, and began to weave themselves into the fabric of Ash Grove's small community. There were fleeting, unsettling moments when Emily felt a chill in the air, a sense of being watched. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She would dismiss these feelings, telling herself it was just the adjustment to a new home, the creaks and groans of an old house settling. But in the back of her mind, the unease lingered, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to notice small, inexplicable things. Objects would be out of place, doors that she was certain had been closed would be found ajar, and there was a strange, persistent odor in the hallway that she couldn't identify. David, ever the rational one, assured her it was nothing, probably just the quirks of an old house. But Emily couldn't help but feel that there was something more, something just out of reach, something that the house was trying to tell her. The people of Ash Grove watched from a distance, their faces a mix of pity and fear. They had seen this before, after all, another family moving into the house, unaware of the darkness that dwelled within. They knew it was only a matter of time before the house revealed its true nature, before the whispers in the shadows grew louder, and the past came rushing back to claim new victims. But Emily and David were blissfully unaware of the house's history, of the tragedies that had unfolded within its walls. They were simply a family looking forward to a bright future, completely oblivious to the fact that the past was about to catch up with them, bringing with it horrors they could never have imagined. The house on Briar Lane was awake once more, and soon it would demand a new chapter in its story, a story that Emily, David, and their children were about to become a part of, whether they were ready or not. One day, everything changed the day Emily heard the first whisper. It started, innocently enough, a faint voice barely audible as she folded laundry in the silence of her home. It was nothing more than a murmur, a soft sound that she dismissed as her imagination. But the voice persisted. Over the following days, it grew stronger, more insistent. And it wasn't alone. Soon, there were many voices, all speaking at once, a cacophony of demands and pleas that filled her mind. Emily tried to ignore them, tried to drown them out with the noise of everyday life, but the voices were relentless. They whispered terrible things, dark secrets from a time long past. They spoke of war, of death, of vengeance. She couldn't understand why she was hearing them or what they wanted from her. As the days passed, Emily's demeanor began to change. She became distant, her once warm and loving eyes now haunted and cold. David noticed the change and grew concerned, but every time he asked her what was wrong, she brushed him off with a forced smile, claiming she was just tired. But the truth was far more sinister. One night, as Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the voices grew louder than ever. Her reflection seemed distorted, her eyes dark and hollow. And then, in the silence of the night, a single voice cut through the noise, clear and commanding. "You must make them pay. They are the enemy." The voice belonged to someone named Carl, a German soldier who had died during World War II. Carl's spirit had latched onto Emily, driven by rage and a desire for retribution against those who had wronged him. In his twisted mind, Emily's family had become his new enemies. Emily's resistance crumbled completely under the relentless pressure of Carl's influence. The once gentle, loving woman was now a shell of her former self, her mind twisted and warped by the malevolent force that had taken root within her. The line between her own thoughts and Carl's had vanished, leaving behind only confusion and terror. It began with small, unsettling changes. Emily would stare blankly into space for hours, her mind lost in a world only she could see. Her once vibrant eyes had dulled, as though the light inside her was slowly being extinguished. She withdrew from her family, locking herself away in the bedroom, the place where she felt Carl's presence most strongly. David noticed the change in his wife, but every attempt to reach her was met with cold indifference or seething hostility. Emily would lash out at him, accusing him of unimaginable betrayals, her voice filled with venom that was not her own. She began to see David not as her husband, but as one of Carl's enemies, an infiltrator who had betrayed her trust. The love that had once bound them was now tainted by suspicion and fear. Ethan and Lily, too, felt the change in their mother. She no longer looked at them with warmth and affection. Instead, her gaze was one of cold calculation, as if she were assessing their loyalty, deciding whether they were friend or foe. The children grew fearful of her, retreating to their rooms, unsure of how to approach the woman who now seemed like a stranger. Emily's mind continued to deteriorate, the boundaries of her identity dissolving completely. She would speak in strange, disjointed sentences, her words a jumbled mix of her own thoughts and Carl's memories. At times, her voice would drop to a deep, menacing tone that wasn't hers, as though Carl himself were speaking through her. These episodes became more frequent, more intense, until it was clear that the Emily they knew was slipping away. She stopped eating, refusing food with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. David pleaded with her, begged her to take just a few bites, but she would only stare at him with vacant eyes, her expression blank. She seemed to be wasting away before their eyes, her body growing thinner and weaker with each passing day. As her physical health declined, so did her mental state. Emily would often sit in silence, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. She no longer responded to her family, no longer seemed to recognize them at all. The woman who had once been their wife and mother was now a lifeless, catatonic figure, trapped in a prison of her own mind. David, desperate to save her, sought help from doctors and therapists, but nothing seemed to reach her. They diagnosed her with severe psychosis, a complete mental breakdown, but no treatment could break through the barrier that Carl had built around her mind. Emily was lost, her consciousness submerged beneath a torrent of anger, fear, and despair that was not her own. The house, too, seemed to change with Emily's decline. The once warm and inviting rooms now felt cold and oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, a tension that grew stronger with each passing day. It was as though the house itself was feeding off Emily's suffering, drawing strength from her torment. In the final days, Emily became completely unresponsive. She would sit in her bedroom, unmoving, her eyes glazed over, her hands clenched into tight fists. David would try to reach her, to coax her back to reality, but it was as if she were no longer there. Her body remained, but her spirit, her essence, was gone, consumed by the darkness that had taken hold. One night, as a storm raged outside, the house seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. The walls creaked and groaned, the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the lights flickered ominously. David, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, looked at his wife, his heart breaking at the sight of her lifeless form. In that moment, he knew that the woman he had loved was gone, that she had been lost to something far beyond his understanding. He reached out to touch her, but she didn't react, her body cold and unyielding. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered her name, one last desperate plea for her to return to him. But Emily didn't respond. She remained as she was, trapped in a catatonic state, her mind shattered, her soul bound by the malevolent force that had claimed her. The house, now a tomb of broken dreams and lost hopes, had taken its final victim. As the storm outside grew stronger, the power in the house finally went out, plunging the room into darkness. David stood there for a long moment, surrounded by silence, before slowly turning away, his heart heavy with grief. The house on Briar Lane had won, and Emily was gone, lost to the same darkness that had claimed so many before her. The house would stand, as it always had, waiting for its next occupants, its next victims, its dark history continuing to repeat itself, leaving behind only echoes of the souls it had consumed. After the tragic night when Emily succumbed to the darkness within her, David Foster was left shattered and desperate. The once vibrant home on Briar Lane was now a scene of unspeakable horror, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. Determined to save the remnants of the woman he loved, David made the heart-wrenching decision to admit Emily to Crestwood Psychiatric Hospital, hoping that professional help could reach her where he and others could not. Crestwood Psychiatric Hospital stood on the outskirts of Ashgrove, a sprawling, austere building that seemed to watch over the town with its cold, unfeeling facade. The hospital had a reputation for treating severe mental health issues, and David clung to the hope that Emily would receive the care she so desperately needed. Upon arrival, Emily was swiftly processed and admitted. The sterile environment was a stark contrast to the warmth and chaos of her former home. The halls of Crestwood were quiet, punctuated only by the distant sounds of other patients and the occasional intercom announcement. Emily was placed in a small, padded room, much like the one she had previously occupied, ensuring her safety and that of others. From the moment she was admitted, it was clear that Emily was no longer the woman David once knew. She remained absent and catatonic, her body motionless, eyes staring blankly into the void. The staff at Crestwood watched her closely, noting her refusal to eat and her complete withdrawal from any form of interaction. Despite their best efforts, Emily did not respond to their treatments or therapies. She seemed trapped in her own mind, a silent prisoner of her torment. As days turned into weeks, Emily's condition showed no signs of improvement. She remained in a perpetual state of silence, her presence almost spectral within the confines of her room. However, her tranquility was fragile. Other patients at Crestwood, unaware of her troubled past, began to interact with her during group sessions and communal activities. Whenever someone spoke to her, attempting to engage or comfort her, Emily would react violently. She would lash out with sudden aggression, pushing people away, her eyes darting away from theirs, as if trying to escape unseen horrors. The nurses and doctors observed these episodes with growing concern. Emily's behavior baffled them. She exhibited signs of extreme paranoia and aggression, traits often associated with schizophrenia. They documented her symptoms meticulously, running tests and consultations, but the root cause of her condition remained elusive. The more they tried to understand her, the deeper the mystery seemed to become. Unbeknownst to the staff and other patients, the malevolent presence that had consumed Emily in her home on Briar Lane had followed her to Crestwood. The hospital, with its own history of hidden pains and unresolved traumas, became a new battleground for the restless spirit of Carl. The whispers that once plagued Emily now echoed through the sterile halls of Crestwood, feeding off the fear and despair that lingered in the air. At night, when the hospital was cloaked in darkness, the atmosphere grew thick with unease. Shadows danced on the walls, and the temperature would drop inexplicably, leaving patients and staff alike shivering in their beds. Emily's room became a focal point of these disturbances, as if the very essence of her torment sought to reclaim her once more. One fateful night, a powerful storm rolled into Ash Grove, the howling winds and relentless rain adding to the already tense atmosphere at Crestwood. The storm knocked out the power, plunging the hospital into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows through the corridors. In the midst of the chaos, a scream echoed through the halls, a sound that pierced the stillness and sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. Nurses rushed to Emily's room, only to find it empty. The door had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Her bed was undisturbed, and the only indication of her presence was the lingering sense of sorrow and fear that hung in the air. The next morning, Crestwood Psychiatric Hospital was abuzz with confusion and fear. Emily Foster had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unsettled spirits. The staff conducted a thorough search of the facility, but Emily was nowhere to be found. Her disappearance baffled the doctors and nurses, who had no explanation for how she could have left her room or the hospital itself. Rumors began to circulate among the patients and staff. Some whispered about restless spirits and curses, recalling the tragic history of the house on Briar Lane. Others speculated about supernatural forces at play, convinced that Carl's vengeance had transcended the boundaries of life and death once more. David Foster was informed of his wife's disappearance with a mixture of relief and dread. While part of him hoped that she had finally found peace, another part feared that the darkness that had consumed her was still at large, lurking in the shadows and waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Emily's disappearance from Crestwood Psychiatric Hospital marked another dark chapter in the haunting legacy of the house on Briar Lane. The spirits that had once tormented Emily continued to roam, their whispers echoing through the corridors of Crestwood and beyond. The town of Ash Grove remained silent, its residents too fearful to speak of the horrors that had unfolded within their midst. The house on Briar Lane stood as a silent sentinel, its windows watching over the town with an eternal gaze, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to fall under its malevolent influence. And somewhere, in the depths of Crestwood Psychiatric Hospital, Emily Foster remained lost, her spirit wandering the halls, forever trapped between worlds, a victim of a curse that refused to die. The cycle of terror continued, a never-ending nightmare that left Ash Grove haunted by the echoes of the past and the restless souls that could never find peace. David couldn't take it anymore. The weight of Emily's disappearance, the horrifying transformation she had undergone, and the suffocating dread that had settled over their lives had become too much to bear. Every corner of the house on Briar Lane seemed to whisper her name, echoing with memories that were now tainted by the darkness that had consumed her. The once beautiful home had become a place of nightmares, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. After Emily vanished from Crestwood Psychiatric Hospital, leaving behind no trace or explanation, David knew that staying in Ash Grove was no longer an option. The house, with its creaking floors and shadowed hallways, felt like it was closing in on him, trapping him in a past that he couldn't escape. The walls that had once been filled with laughter and love now seemed haunted, filled with the ghost of his wife and the malevolent force that had taken her from him. He watched as Ethan and Lily grew quieter, their smiles fading as they, too, felt the oppressive weight of their surroundings. The children had lost their mother, and now it seemed they were losing their home as well. They rarely played outside anymore, and their once vibrant personalities had dulled, as if the house was draining the life from them, just as it had done to Emily. Determined to protect what was left of his family, David made the decision to sell the house. It wasn't easy. Part of him clung to the hope that Emily might still come back, that she might somehow find her way home. But deep down, he knew that the woman he had loved was gone, and that staying in the house would only lead to more suffering for him and his children. He put the house on the market, aware of the irony that it was now he who was leaving, just as the previous owners had done so many years ago. The real estate agent, the same woman who had sold them the house, tried to mask her surprise, but David could see it in her eyes. She didn't ask why he was selling, and he didn't offer an explanation. What could he say? That the house was cursed? That it had stolen his wife from him? No one would believe it, and those who did would only fear it more. Packing up their belongings was a painful process, each item a reminder of the life they had once had. David moved through the house mechanically, boxing up clothes, toys, and memories, trying to keep his emotions in check for the sake of the children. Ethan and Lily helped as best they could, their small hands placing their favorite toys into boxes with a sense of finality that broke David's heart. Finally, the day came when they had packed the last of their things. The moving truck sat in the driveway, waiting to take them away from Briar Lane. David stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking back at the house that had once been a symbol of hope and a bright future. Now, it was nothing more than a monument to grief, loss, and a darkness he could never fully understand. He took Ethan and Lily by the hand, leading them out of the house and into the car. As they drove away, David didn't look back. He couldn't. The past was behind him, and whatever lay ahead, he would face it without the weight of Briar Lane hanging over them. The house, with its secrets and its curses, would soon belong to someone else. David only hoped that whoever came next would be strong enough to resist the pull of its darkness, or that they would be wise enough to leave before it was too late. But the spirits of the war are restless, and Carl's vengeance is not complete. The whispers in the dark waited for the next family to move into the house on Briar Lane and suffer the same fate.